We're going to start with the octopus on a spring again, okay? Right now, the net force is 0. There's a spring force which pulls up. There's a weight force which pulls down, okay? And so there's the two forces. They're equal and opposite. The net force is equal to 0. Well, how do we measure weight force? And actually, one way you can measure it is use a spring like this. If this is heavier, it stretches the spring farther, okay? And we could use that as a measure of the weight because the spring force is just equal to the weight force. And in fact, that's one way that you can measure the weight of things. If I have this container of jelly beans here and I want to measure its weight, I can hang it from a spring scale. And this is a spring that's it's a helical spring. And when I pull on it, instead of stretching, it's going to go in a circle. And if I lift up on the top of this scale, I can see the weight of the jelly beans is 22 newtons, okay? But in fact, I haven't measured the weight. What this number tells us is the spring force. If I pull on this with a force of 22 newtons, that's how far the dial goes to the side. So I'm just measuring the force. I'm measuring the spring force. I'm pulling with a force of 22 newtons. It's pulling back with a force of 22 newtons. That's what the dial is reading. How hard is the spring pulling? So what I'm actually doing here is exactly the same problem as I did with the octopus. The spring is pulling up with 22 newtons. The weight force is pulling down with 22 newtons. And so I'm assuming that the spring force and the weight force are equal to each other. And that's absolutely true if I'm in equilibrium. If I'm in equilibrium, acceleration is equal to 0. There's no net force. Weight force and spring force are equal to each other. But how about if you're not in equilibrium? And that brings us to the concept of apparent weight. And for the next piece, we're going to go to the elevator. We're in the elevator, and we're moving. We're moving at a constant speed. Acceleration is 0, net force is 0. But now, watch what happens. There was a small bump, and the bump corresponded with the elevator stopping its motion. And when that happened, there was a small increase in the reading on this dial. This went up to 23. Now we know the weight is 22, but the dial went up to 23. So that tells us something. Think about the forces that act. Spring force up, weight force down. For just a second, the spring force was bigger, okay? So I'm going to ask you this question. Right when we had that bump, when it went up to 23, was the elevator moving up or moving down? We'll give you some choices. Okay, we're going to repeat the motion again. Weight force pulling down with 22 newtons, spring force pulling up with 22 newtons. We're moving at a constant speed. When the elevator comes to a stop, it goes up to 23. Spring force is bigger. Weight force is still 22. This is 23. There's a net force upward. And so there's a net force upward. The acceleration is upward. That means we were moving down and we were stopping. And here we are in the basement. Now let's think about what this is telling us. There's a concept in chapter 5 called apparent weight. When the elevator starts moving upward, I feel heavier. And when it reaches the top and stops, I feel lighter. But it's not just me, it's also the jar of jelly beans. We're going back up to the top floor of the building. When we do that, there's a small reduction in the dial reading here. Now in fact, you can't feel the weight force acting on you. What you feel acting on you is a force which supports you. Right now, I feel the force of the floor on my feet. That's what I sense as my weight. But that's not my real weight, that's my apparent weight. And what this scale is measuring is the apparent weight of the jar. And so as it's moving up and down, the apparent weight, the weight as recorded by the scale, varies. It's not the actual weight, it's the apparent weight. And it's the force that supports an object, the force of the floor supporting me, the force of the spring scale supporting the jar of jelly beans. And there's an ultimate extension of this whole idea of apparent weight that we want to look at back in the studio. We're going to look at this elevator problem pretty extensively in the textbook because it's a very instructive one. And ultimately the conclusion we come to is this. Your apparent weight is the contact force that supports you. So I'm holding this bear, and the bear has a certain weight, but the bear's apparent weight is my upward force on it. And that makes sense because if I'm trying to figure out how much this bear weighs, what I do is I hold it out and I see how hard do I have to push on it in order to hold it up. That's what I perceive to be its weight. But now if I take the bear, toss it up in the air, while it's in the air, my hand's not touching it. it's in free fall, it's accelerating, the net force is not zero. The only force acting is the weight force. Well, in that case, there's no contact force supporting it. The net force is just the weight force. It's accelerating. What's the apparent weight equal to in that circumstance? We'll give you some choices. Well, right then, if the bear is in the air and it's moving upward, there's one force which is acting as the weight force. There's no normal force. There's no spring force. There's no rope force supporting the bear. There's no contact force supporting it. And so the apparent weight is zero. That is the condition we call weightlessness. Now, I'm going to show you a demonstration of this. I'm going to bring over a little trampoline. I'm going to stand on it. And then I've got these things called groan tubes. And when I take this and I turn it upside down, you can see the little cylinders fall through here. When they fall through there, they make a noise. But if there was no gravity, they wouldn't fall. There wouldn't be any noise. Well, I can't turn off gravity, but I can turn off my apparent weight. And I can do that by being in free fall, and I can be in free fall by jumping on the trampoline. And when I'm in the air, it's as if I'm weightless. From my point of view, it's as if there's no gravity. Me and the tubes and the little things inside the tubes all fall together, and there's no noise. That's a condition of weightlessness. It's not zero weight, but it's zero apparent weight. Now, I'll show you another demonstration of this. I've got these two little stuffed hamsters, and they're connected by elastic cords to this container. So if I take this and toss this up in the air, from the container's point of view, it's weightless. It's as if I've turned off gravity. So from the hamster's point of view, there's no weight force pulling them down. There's a tension force pulling them up. And what do? You know what they do. They get pulled up, and they end up in the bucket. So that's a little bit about weight and a force that's related to it, apparent weight.